afternoon, students. Today we will be checking our homework. We're going to be solving quadratic equations by factoring, and the homework will be 10.8. Today students will be able to solve quadratic equations by factoring, and then you will get each factor and equal it to 0 to solve for x. So let's start with x squared plus 6x. So x squared plus 6x plus 5 equals 0. So as you can see, now we have an equation. It's not just a trinomial, but now it's equals to 0. And yesterday we were solving for x by canceling. But in this case, we have a trinomial, and it's going to be harder to cancel, especially since we're going to have two terms that are not like terms. So instead, what we're going to be doing is factoring this. But before we start with that, I want to ask, what is 2 times 10? Well, that's 20. These are called factors, and this is called the product. For this to be equals to 0, one of the two factors have to be 0. So, for example, 2 times 0 is equals to 0, or 0 times 2 will be equals to 0. Okay, so this is going to be very important for solving for x in this case. So you can continue to do the diamond, or today I'm just going to focus on getting just in your mind, starting to get those numbers without having to do the diamond. So what two numbers multiplied equals 5, but when you add them it's equals to 6? Well, since both are positive, you can say that it's going to be 1 times 5 equals 5, and 1 plus 5 equals 6. So those are going to be my two numbers used for the factors. So it's going to be x plus 1, x plus 5. And again, the order doesn't matter. And that's equals to 0. So remember, this is the product. These are the two factors. Okay? It's like saying 20 is the same thing as 2 times 10 right here. Okay? 20, which is the product, is the same as 2 times 10. Both are 20, right? So what this says is that this factor multiplied times this factor is equals to 0. For that to be true, one of the factors have to be equals to 0. So what we're going to do, without having to solve, I just want to say, what will the value of x be for this expression, this part, this factor, to be equals to 0? This, to make it 0, then the x has to be -1, because -1 plus 1, that will be 0. So we say that x is -1. Or if we want the other factor to be 0, what would x have to be to make this 0? Well, this would have to be -5, because -5 plus 5 is 0, so -5. So this basically is the answer. And something that I want you to notice is that it's just the opposite of the other, right? If it's +1, then the value of x is -1. If it's a +5, then the value of x is -5. So that's going to be the answers. Later on, we're going to relate it to, okay, what does this mean? These help us find the two x-axis, the two x-intercepts, I'm sorry. So we know that the intercepts of x are going to be a -1 and -5. And your parabola might be like this, or it might be like this. We'll see about that, and it all depends on this. But again, this is what we're finding. We're finding the two places where my parabola will meet the x-axis. Again, nothing to worry about, it's just for you to have some idea of what this will be relating to later on. But this is what we're trying to look. Now, some professors might ask you to actually solve this instead of just by memory saying, oh, it's the opposite. They might say, okay, you have to equal each factor to 0. So x plus 1 equals 0, and x plus 5 is equals to 0. I start solving, so all I did was to get each of the factors and make each one of them equal to 0. Okay, so I subtract 1 from both sides, and so my x is -1, which we had done that by memory, right? Or just by observing and analyzing it. And here, if we're adding 5, we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. And so this cancels, and our x is equals to -5. Again, we already had found that out by just observing and analyzing what number would go in there to make it 0. The question is, do you have to do this for the homework? I'm happy with this. I do want to see the factors though, okay? I want to see you factoring, either just by analyzing the numbers or with the diamond, either way, but and then the answers, knowing that it's the opposite. Okay, another example. X squared minus 10x plus 9 is equals to 0. So again, I'm going to factor and I'm going to say, okay, what two numbers multiply is equals to 9, but when we add them, it's equals to -10. Since when we add them is -10, that means that both of them have to be negative to make it positive. And it's going to be 1 times 9, -1 times -9, +9. -1 plus -9, -10x. So, I open my parentheses and I just use those numbers. If I will be asking for you to do this, which I'm not, again, you can do it just by getting the opposite. This is what you would do. X minus 1 is equals to 0. X minus 9 is equals to 0. By doing this, we're just making sure that one of the factors is equals to 0. Okay, and now once we have those small equations with each one of the factors, we start solving for x. And so x equals to 1. We start solving for x, and x can also be +9. So my x is equals to 1 or +9. Okay, these two factors. Again, if you don't want to do this little processing here, just remember that if it's negative, then this is going to be positive. If this is negative, then it's going to be positive. Again, this is kind of review because we're just factoring. It's just this additional part where you're equaling it to 0. So what two numbers multiply is -10, but when you, let's see, this is negative, that means you have one positive and one negative, which makes you subtract. So when you subtract them, you have it equals to 3. So it's going to be 2 times 5, because when you subtract them, it's equals to 3, but this tells me the sign of the greater number. So that means that the negative will have to be the smaller number. Okay, because this is positive, that sign goes with the number that is bigger. So the other one is that it's negative. Okay, so we open our parentheses. and we have x minus 2, x plus 5, and again we can very fast check. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x, 5 times, x times 5 is 5x, so negative 2x and 5x, it is equal to 3x, which is perfect. Okay, so without having it to equal to 0 for each factor, we will know that the answer for x is, since this is negative, it's going to be positive 2. Or, since this is positive, the answer will be negative 5. So these are my two answers for x. Again, in a parabola, it would be the 2 in here, the negative 5 in here, and so those will be the two places where my parabola would intersect with the x-axis. Okay, now let's say that your teacher or your professor does ask you to do the equality to 0. So x minus 2 is 0, x plus 5 is 0. All you're doing is just taking each factor and start to solve for x. So x is equals to 2, which is what we got before. We subtract 5, and so x is equals to 0 minus 5 is negative 5. So if you notice, we got the same answers. The shortcut is just the opposite of the second term. Okay? Okay, let's do some more. So now in here we have both our negatives. And so when this is negative, we know that one is positive and one is negative. And so when we multiply, it's equals to 10, but when we subtract, it's equals to negative 3. That means that this is the sign of the greater one. Well, it's similar to the previous one, right? So it's 2 times 5 equals 10. That means that the bigger one is going to have the sign of this one. So the 5 goes here and the 2 here. Again, this sign goes with the bigger of the two factors. And when I subtract them, 5 minus 2 is 3. With the sign of the bigger one is negative. So perfect. So we're going to have x minus 5, x plus 2, and that's equals to 0. With the shortcut, it's just going to be x equals the opposite, so it's 5, or the opposite, so negative 2. That's going to be my answer. Again, if they ask you to do the equals to 0, it would just be x minus 5 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0. You just start solving, plus 5 plus 5, and so x equals 5. There you go. Minus 2, x equals negative 2. There you go. Okay, so that would be your next example. Okay, this next one we saw a little bit yesterday of how to solve by canceling, and so I'm going to teach it to you both ways because it can be solved with factoring and by canceling. The other ones cannot be done by canceling unless we take more steps, which will make it a little bit more complex. But by canceling, we're going to cancel the 49, so we will be adding 49 to both sides. And so we have x squared is equals to 0 plus 49 is 49. I take the square root of both sides, and so my x is equals to plus or minus. Remember, whenever we take the square root of something is plus or minus, and the square root of 49 is 7. So that means that I have the two answers right there, positive 7, negative 7. By factoring, sorry about the noise, we know that when we have the difference of two squares, then I just open my parentheses, I put the square root of the first one here and here. I always have one positive and one negative. That's what cancels the middle term, because one positive and one negative are the same cancels. And then the square root of the second one, which is positive 7, negative 7. So the x is equals to the opposite, meaning negative 7, or the opposite of this, which is positive 7. If you notice, we got the same two answers. The only thing is that this is arranged in a different way, but it's exactly the same answer. If you were to do the factoring part, I mean the factor equal to 0 and this factor equal to 0, so it would be x plus 7 equals 0 and x minus 7 equals 0. We cancel by subtracting, and so x equals 0 minus 7 is negative 7, which is that one. By canceling, we cancel the 7, and so x is equals to 0 plus 7, 7. Okay, so that will be the two answers. Okay, one more example and then you can start working on 10.8. For this next example, you already have the factors. Okay, you already have this part. You're not given the trinomial, which could be in trinomial form, but right now we're just gonna give you the factors already. So what is the value of x? We say that is the opposite, but since this is not, we're not adding or subtracting anything to this factor, we're just gonna say that for this to be equals to 0, well, we would just have to replace the x by 0, and that makes the whole term, I mean the whole factor 0. For this factor to be 0, the opposite of negative 2 is 2, and that way 2 minus 2 is 0, so that makes it work. And then to make this equals to 0, all you have to do is just the opposite of 3, so it's negative 3. So now we have 3 factors, and therefore we have 3 different answers. Now if we have to equal each of these factors by 0, this is what you would have to do. The first factor equals 0. The second factor, x minus 2 equals 0. And the third factor, x plus 3 equals 0. In here, there's nothing else to work with, so that's all you have. In here, we can cancel by adding 2, and so x is equals to 2. In here, we can subtract 3, and so x is equals to negative 3. If you notice, we were able to do that just by observing, so 0, 0, 2, 2, negative 3, negative 3. Okay, we were able to do that just by analyzing what number would make that factor 0. Okay, so this is it for this lesson. You can now start working on 10.8, and I hope this video helped. Thank you.